Welcome, Martin.
Well, thank you and good evening. This is the first of 3 lectures where I'm going to be looking at areas relating to cities. And I started with housing, and I'm going to be looking at urban finance and the issue about water and sewage. But I'm starting tonight with housing crisis. And I think that the housing crisis is one of the most significant political problems facing the country and facing the new Labour government, which hopes to build 300,000 houses a year, or a total, if it has a full 5-year term, of 1.5 million houses. I think more particularly, it's a crisis for everybody except those of my age, of baby boomers, because what we have experienced is a huge untaxed gain in the value of our houses. The worry of the baby boomers is whether they will have to pay more inheritance tax. But for young people, it's a major issue. For young people, their worry is whether they will ever be able to buy a house. As you see from this graph, they're only half as likely to own a house by the age 30 as baby boomers. If you look at each age cohort, the percentage owning a house by the age 30 is dropping and dropping. The Institute for Fiscal Studies calculates that in 1995 to 6, 65% of those aged between 25 and 34 who were in the middle of the income distribution owned their house. That figure had fallen to 27% by 2015 to 16. So the average age of the first purchase of a house in 1960 was 23. In 2007, it was 31. In 2017, 33. So young people have a real housing crisis. To buy a house, one needs to save longer to get an average size deposit. For a typical family in their late 20s or early 30s, in the early 1990s, it took 8 years to save for a deposit. Now it's 14 years. And the deposit needed has increased since the global financial crisis. In 1989, the deposit might be 5%. Now it's 15%. And that means reliance upon the bank of mum and dad. Nearly half of first-time buyers have financial support from parents, on average about £25,000. Well, obviously, a lot of young adults don't have parents with that sort of spare cash. So more young people are renting, usually from the baby boomers, who now own very often a buy-to-let property as part of their pension portfolio, or they stay at home. It means delaying independent adulthood. Sorry, going the wrong way. And this means that there is a change in the overall level of owner occupation. The blue portion of the graph there is owner occupation for those in their early adulthood. And as you see, it peaks in the 80s and is now dropping. And the percentage which is growing is the yellow private rent, or the light green at the top, staying at home. So owner occupation has been falling from the mid-2000s. House building is low and does not respond to higher prices. As you see in this graph, you have house prices going up, and you would expect higher house prices would lead to more investment. In fact, investment is going down. It's a fall in investment leading to the rise in housing prices. House building is low and does not respond to higher prices. The level of residential investment shown here is particularly low in this country. There is an unusually large rise in house prices compared with income in this country. You see the rise in house prices there, and the pink line is the long-term trend. So a very large rise in house prices compared with income, and of the G7 countries, the richest countries, global countries in the world, Britain has had the largest rise in house prices averaged compared to its average disposable income since 1970, and especially since 1997. And you should see here house prices compared with average real earnings. You see how it shoots up there from the mid-80s and about 1990 onwards, before slightly stabilising. So, very large rise of house prices, much faster than income levels. The price of housing is the second highest of the 38 members of the OECD, the Organisation of Economic Cooperation and Development. It's only behind Finland. And housing takes a larger share of income than in other countries in the OECD for houses which are becoming smaller. In 1980, the average family spent 9% of its income on housing. In 2024, that has risen to 17%. And that is the most serious for poorest households. The proportion of income spent on housing for the poorest households has risen from 17 to 34% over that period, from 1980 to 2024, whereas for the richest, it's dropped from 5 to 8%. So what we have is the poorest and the youngest households are renting, the older and better off are owning, see in the graph here. The cost of renting are higher than in other tenures. Income inequality is now being affected by the housing costs. In the 1960s and 70s, income inequality was not really being affected by the high price of housing. A lot of people were in social housing. From 1979, it's had a major impact. So high housing costs for poorer people leading to growing inequality. And the price of land is also high. It's a graph from John Mulborough's piece, Why We Need a Green Land Tax. And you see the price of land in Britain is that top line, the blue line, the dashed line. And you see the price of land for housing in this country is very high. And this means that land is a higher share of the overall value of the house in this country than in other OECD countries, for which we have data. In the United Kingdom, less than 30% of the value of a house is in the building, 70% in the land. In Germany, 55% is in the value of the house. 55% in the value of the land. So it's a much bigger difference here between the value of land in Germany, to take one example, and the United Kingdom. So there's been a change in tenure. In the late 1970s, ownership with a mortgage accounted for about 26% of households, and social rent, usually below the market rent, was 26%, and private rent was only about 13%. Since then, if you remember the graph I showed you earlier on, that one, obviously you've had a drop in the number of social housing, the green line there. And that's because of right to buy, and the block on using the proceeds from the sale of council housing to build more houses. In 2022 to 23, only about 9,500 social houses were built in England, mainly by housing associations, not by councils, but 24,000 more were sold. So social rent has been overtaken by private renting, where standards are often low and rents are expensive. By 2013, outright owners past those who were owning with a mortgage. So now about 35% are outright owners of housing, the baby boom generation. And in half the parliamentary constituencies in this country, outright owners are the largest group of housing tenure. And they're likely to be NIMBYs, not in my backyard, and they're not worried by high rents. Okay, but that's not the end of the problem. Sorry if I go the right way, beg your pardon. Because we also have a crisis in property tax. Property tax is regressive. So people who are poorer pay, take the example of Hartlepool and Westminster, people who are poorer pay more council tax. And you see the variation there between areas. If you live in Westminster, you're only paying £829, whereas if you live in a poorer area like Middlesbrough or Hartlepool, you're paying a lot more. So the council tax is regressive both by income levels and between parts of the country. That's from a pressure group called Fairer Shares. And this contributes to inequality, this crisis I've been talking about. It's leading to rising levels of inequality in the property wealth. So baby boomers, like people of my age, have rising asset values in their housing, where it's unaffordable for others. You have income inequality as a result of the cost of different forms of tenure, a rise in the cost of renting relative to incomes, particularly for young people, hitting those then who are trying, starting out on their adult life. And this also harms productivity and growth. People are saving, who have money to save, into housing rather than into other more productive uses. Britain has one of the lowest saving rates of any developed country. So Britain has an unusual mix of high prices, low level of building. Now, the question is, why have we got into this particular mess that we're now in? Why did it happen, and what can be done? Now, I'm a historian, so I always like to go back into time to say, why did this happen? The situation was not always so dire. It dates from the 1980s. Before the 1980s, the housing market was delivering more houses at a lower cost to residents through a mix of social rental and owner occupation. The market that existed up to the 1980s took on the shape that it did after the First World War. And the housing market that emerged after the 1980s is distinctive. It's unlike its counterparts in Europe. So I want to try and understand why this distinctive pattern of tenure emerged in Britain, why it has changed over time. So let's go back to before the First World War. Now, before the First World War, we have a particular type of housing market in Britain. Unlike what I've been talking about now. Fine, there are slums, of course, poor housing, remnants of the early days of the Industrial Revolution. But it looked as if the housing market was improving. So before the First World War, about 90% of housing was private rental and was overwhelmingly owned by small house landlords. Most house building then was undertaken by small speculative builders. Let's take one example which has been studied, Camberwell in South London. In the late 1870s, there were 416 builders, and just over half of them built no more than 6 houses. There were 15 large firms who built over 60 houses, which is 31% of the total. So it's very much a small and medium enterprise building structure. They're speculative builders who are prone to periods of boom. They enter, there's very easy cost of entry. They can get credit for land, they get credit for building materials. They oversupply. So a period of boom when supply overshoots demand, leading to high vacancies and falling rent. And the finance for these house builders and the house landlords who own them came mainly from two sources. The first is building societies. They were mainly local. They take household savings and they lend that out in loans for house purchase. It was a closed system. It's taking in small savings and lending it out to small house landlords. It's not linked into the money market. And the second, perhaps the major part of the housing finance, comes from solicitors who are looking after people's wills. They're acting as executors. They're looking after trust funds. And they provide short-term loans to builders for interest only that could be called in when needed, when then you would go and remortgage with a solicitor. So it's a closed system rather than being one locked into the money market. And there's also a ready supply of land at low prices. Because of the import of grain from North America in particular, also from Australia, Argentina, the price of grain dropped radically after about 1870, and agricultural rents and land values dropped by about 40% between 1870 and 1900. So land is available, and of course there's a lack of planning regulations. There were bylaws so that the houses were built to a reasonable standard. So it's controlling the house layout, but it's not controlling where you build the house. It's not controlling access to land. And great aristocratic landowners, many of them here in London, like the Bedford Estate and so on, could provide an infrastructure of roads. They have access to cheap money. They provide the roads, the drains, to allow speculative builders, these small enterprises, to operate. So it's a housing market which is providing a lot of new accommodation in the late 19th century. According to the statistician Robert Giffin, in 1884 he said that over the previous 50 years, working class wages have doubled, but rents have only risen by 150% for a much higher quality of house. And another statistician, G.H. Wood, said in 1909 that half the increase in rent was accounted for by new features, bathrooms, running water, toilets, so on. So housing was becoming cheaper compared with income. There was also confidence that housing was more affordable than in other countries. Around about 1910, the Board of Trade, the government department, carried out a survey of a number of countries about the relationship between wages and rent. So you see here that the United States was more favourable. Obviously, land is even more cheaper there. But France and Germany, wages are lower. But in case of Germany, look, rents are 23% higher than they are in England and Wales. So apart from the United States of America, which of course has particularly cheap availability of land, in Europe, the housing market in Britain seems to be more favourable. So in Germany, weekly wages were 70% lower than in England and Wales, but rents were 23% higher. Now, within Britain, there were variations. The worst areas of housing in this country were in the northeast of England, but above all in the tenements of Scotland, of Glasgow in particular, which had higher rents. So it's not a uniformly favourable picture. There are still slums, but the general picture shown there is that the housing market in Britain is getting better. So then there's a crisis in Edwardian Britain. You have a boom, like in these houses in Battersea, a huge boom around 1900. Rents were sticky. Wages were starting to rise after 1900, but rents weren't going up because there's an oversupply of housing. In Glasgow, to take one example, the level of vacant properties rose from about 3% in 1890. A boom of housing, vacancies were 11% in 1910. So rents were sticky. Now, that was cyclical. So there had been cycles before of oversupply of housing dropping rents. You might expect a recovery. But my argument would be that this recovery was stopped, was blocked by a number of other things happening. The one was a problem of local government finance. So I mentioned there's a problem of local government finance now, and there was another problem of local government finance before the First World War. House property paid the rates, which some of us can still remember, the rates, by the value of the property. It was regressive, so smaller properties paid a higher proportion of their value than larger properties. But more than that, or as well as that, the amount of money local government needed for the new sewers, drains, public health, schools, hospitals was going up faster than the rateable value of the towns. So the rate in the pound, the tax, was rising. That is putting pressure then on the rate base. Now, what is happening in the case of England, I say England, not Scotland, is that the rates in theory fall upon the tenant, the resident, who are on weekly lets. So there's a huge churn. So in order to make the collection of the rates easier, the local authorities asked the owner to pay the rate in return for a large discount of about 20%. This is called compounding for the rates. So if you're a local authority after 1900 and you need to build more schools and hospitals and so on, you think, how am I going to get more money? I will cut the compounding rate. So rates were going up, the tax was going up, and the discount was falling at a time when there was a housing boom, vacancies, squeezed the profit of the private landlords. Also, interest rates went up after 1900. So we have then a serious problem of profitability. And taken together, that leads to a serious fall in house values. Completely unlike what I've just been talking about in our present crisis. Taking two areas, Hampstead in North London, Camberwell in South London, and this is the number of years purchased. You take the annual rent and you multiply it by the number of years of purchase of that rent. And you see this massive drop, about 40% drop in the value of housing before the First World War. So Avner Offer, from whom I took these figures, says there's a 40 to 50% decline in London in the price of housing. My data shows in Glasgow a fall of 36%. And the problem is most serious, indeed, and I'll explain why this is important in a moment, in Glasgow, with its tenement houses. Scotland had a different pattern of tenure. I said in England, working class housing is let on a weekly rent. In Glasgow, in 1905, 84% of properties were under £20 in value for working class, were held on yearly lets. And that's a serious problem. Workers are on weekly contracts for employment. They're paid a weekly wage. They can be sacked at a moment's notice, but they're locked in to yearly rents. So there's a discrepancy between the housing market and the labour market, between when you receive your wage and when you pay the rent, and indeed pay the rates, annual. There's a very high level of eviction because people couldn't keep up the payment of the rent. And there was a right for the landlord to sequester, that is, to seize goods for the non-payment of rent. And there was no compounding of rates. So this is a serious problem leading up to the First World War. And tenants and local authorities were pressing for the introduction of compounding to ease the collection. The owners are hostile. They don't want to be responsible because they're only going to be given a very low compounding discount to do it. So what is happening then? In 1911, a deal is struck. Compounding is introduced, but at a low discount. The tenants gain a loss of sequestration, not seizing of their goods, which was creating serious social problems. There was a shift to shorter tenancies, but in compensation, the landlords were given the right of summary eviction of tenants who didn't pay. Now, this is going to lead to a serious problem during the First World War, and this is what really leads to the major change in the tenure. Could these issues have been resolved within the cyclical pattern I talked about before? Perhaps, but then the war comes along, and that leads to problems. Housing shortage is already coming to an end, but it's also an inflow of people working in the munitions industry during the war. Landlords see an opportunity to increase the rent, and that leads to a rent strike, as you see on this slide in Glasgow in October 1915, an explosion of tension. What was the government going to do? Well, this response of the government in 1915 leads to a major change in the housing market. The immediate solution in 1915 was rent control. Landlords were not allowed to increase their rent above August 1914, and also mortgages were not allowed to be called in. Remember what I said about private mortgages being on short let and short term they could be called in. They were not to increase their rate and they could not be called in. This is therefore seriously undermining the whole basis of the rental sector. It's hitting the provision of finance from solicitors and executors who were not able to take their money out to put it into areas where they could get a higher rate of return. How to resolve that crisis of the housing market? Well, to build homes fit for heroes, to build council houses. If the controls were taken off at the end of the war, obviously the rents would soar, and that would lead to more social tension. At the time, there's already serious social unrest. People are already concerned about the Russian Revolution. Some increase in rent was allowed, but it was below inflation. So controls were kept. And the idea was you would remove the shortage of housing by building council housing. That would remove the shortage, and then you could go back to the system as it existed before 1914. The problem was it was impossible for local authorities at the end of the war, when costs were high, both for material and labour, to build enough houses. It was thought that 500,000 houses were needed to remove the shortage. Only 170,000 were built. The result of that was that rent controls were retained. In 1931, 69% of housing in England and Wales still had controls. And although there was some liberalisation in 1933, it was then extended during the war and remained in place after the war. So, it's true, more council housing was built in the 1920s, late 1920s, and in the 1930s with very large slum clearance schemes. But what also happens is there's a shift of building societies now to owner-occupation. They now start to target their loans to owner-occupiers rather than to house landlords. The funds going into building societies increased, become more national rather than just local, bringing in savings to the expanding areas of London and the southeast. Interest rates drop after 1931 when Britain left the gold standard. There's a fall in costs during the Great Depression, reducing deposits and extended time to buy. So we get a major shift in the nature of ownership of housing, which you see here in a survey carried out by the British government in 1938. So of all the houses built in the interwar period, 49% of them were for owner occupation, which means overall it goes up to 34.9%. Private rental drops, and you have obviously an increase in public rental. So there's a big shift there in the nature of tenure in the interwar period. And it's that tenure system, which I'm talking about coming in after the First World War, which essentially remains in place after 1945 under both Labour and Conservative governments. It's owner-occupation housing financed by building societies, this closed system I'm talking about, where people are buying the house to live in for use value rather than expecting a real gain in the price of the housing. They weren't looking for, increasing their wealth, gaining their asset. And you have local authority housing since the First World War and after the Second World War, funded from local taxation and borrowing and government grants. At the end of the Second World War, there's a further change, of course. That's the Green Belt and planning controls. The Town and Country Planning Act of 1947 in particular. And what that did, apart from introducing a green belt, was tax the increase in the value of the land. Obviously, having a green belt will in itself increase the value of the land because it's restricting the supply of land for building. But what the Labour government did after the war was introduce a development charge of 100%. So the increase in the value of land from agricultural use to development use was taken by the community. It was abolished by the Conservatives when they came in after 1951. Labour reintroduced a betterment levy of 40% in 1967, abolished by Ted Heath in 1970. Labour again introduced a development tax in 1976, abolished in 1985. So that is something just to bear in mind. What we're talking about here, the fact that there had been land value tax, but then it's removed. But in other senses, I mentioned there was a difference between Labour and Conservatives over the land taxation. Both Labour and Conservatives were committed to building housing. New homes for 1 million folk, that's 300,000 houses, which was pledged by Harold Macmillan. And of course, some of it is like in the Park Hill estate up in Sheffield, high rise, changing from the housing estates, low rise, that dominated the interwar period. But the houses being shown there on the Conservative Party manifesto are low-rise housing. And of course, new towns as well, like Milton Keynes. So the Conservatives delivered on that pledge of Harold Macmillan. Now, this is overturned in the 1980s. You have right to buy, of course. You have right to buy introduced in the 1980s, and also financial liberalisation. So there's nothing preordained about the current crisis. It's a conscious policy decision being made. And what I would like to do now is pick up the comparison with Germany I've been hinting at already, particularly picking up the work of John Muhlbauer of the University of Oxford. He looks at a comparison with Germany to show that, in his words, that the crisis in Britain was self-inflicted. This goes back to my opening point about the rise in house prices in Britain rising compared with the average disposable income, whereas in Germany, between 1970 and 2010, house prices fell compared to the average disposable income. So there's something different about Britain. So what I would like to turn to now is what went wrong in Britain, and let's take Germany as a comparator to see why there might be a difference. And I will point to 5 differences. The first is a difference in housing investment and supply. If you remember that earlier graph where I showed the drop in investment in housing, but a rise in the house prices, It seems as if, in Britain, about half the rise in house prices since 1997 is a result of inadequate residential investment, which did not match the growth of population or income. Whereas in Germany, residential investment has more than kept pace with the growth of population and income. Now, a policy which is being proposed, both by Michael Gove for the Conservatives and by the present Labour government, is that the solution is to ease planning controls. This is not correct. If you look at Germany, permission was given to build 261,000 houses, and 86% of them were built. In the United Kingdom, in 2014 to 15, permission was granted to build 262,000 housing, so much the same, but only 48% of them were built. So the issue isn't permission to build, it's whether or not builders actually do build. And you can see that they might argue, well, why build more? Because all we'll do is reduce the price and reduce our profitability. So the issue is not the hold-up in planning, as is often claimed. It's a failure to build what is allowed. The issue is more about forcing builders to actually build. Now, this is not a party political point. I have a quote from Richard Kluwer, who was the Conservative, or is the Conservative leader of Wiltshire County Council, who said to the Financial Times a couple of weeks ago that the problem is builders gaming the system. They get permission and then avoid, he said, larger developments, because larger developments have tougher Section 106 requirements, that is the obligation of the developer to build schools, roads and so on. They also know that councils need to maintain a 5-year pipeline of projects to meet a housing target. And if they don't meet that target, and of course builders can make sure they don't meet the target, there's a presumption in favour of approving residential developments which allows developers to do as they please. So Richard Kluwer, the Conservative leader of Wiltshire County Council, complains the result of this is piecemeal developments rather than larger, better planned projects. You can see there could be a cross-party consensus on that. So that's one point then. Not planning, it's not building. The second point is the differences in the land market. I've already said at the beginning that the value of land is a much higher proportion of the value of the house than it is in Germany. And here you see the example in the United Kingdom of land prices, a couple of big peaks, but look at that trend from the 1990s. Land prices are soaring ahead. In Britain, the landowner takes virtually all the planning gain from permission to develop. So I live just outside Cambridge. In Cambridge and the Cambridge City and the surrounding area of South Cambridgeshire, the government's valuation office in 2017 said the value of an acre of land, a hectare of land, after development permission was given, was £5.95 million in Cambridge City and £5.3 million in the surrounding area of South Cambridgeshire. Without permission, agricultural land is worth about £20,000 a hectare. A report by the Centre for Progressive Policy claims that the uplift from agricultural to residential use is 275 times, which is about on a par with the figures I've just given you. There is some clawback through Section 106 requirements to provide some public benefit, school, leisure centre, or whatever. But that can be reduced on the grounds of viability. The house developer can say, well, it's not viable for me to provide more social housing or more public benefit because it will reduce my profit. So what John Mulbar points out is that British developers are mainly land speculators making profits from land banks. and that their management efforts go into the complicated process of finding land, securing permission, and making a capital gain, rather than improving their productivity and quality of the houses they built. Large firms become more dominant. A decline in small and medium firms. Remember what I said about small and medium firms before the First World War? Well, they've declined radically. In 1988, there were about 12,000 small and medium building firms. By 2018, about 3,000. Small and medium firms are only building about 25% of the housing. Of course, the large firms deny that they are engaging in land banking, but I think that most people believe that they actually were. The Competition and Markets Authority found that large firms were holding more land than was needed for a well-functioning market. Now, it's true that planning has become more complicated, more complex, but I think that this land banking is more important. In Germany, local authorities can cap land values at the price it had at the time permission was granted. It's easier to acquire land for infrastructure and to capture part of the increase in value from planning gain. In Germany, small and medium firms build around half the houses, and management focuses upon the quality and the efficiency of building. Land costs are a lower share, and materials and labour costs, the quality of the house, is a higher share. The next change, or next difference, is differences in the mortgage credit market. Now, I was talking about the housing market, finance market before the First World War and after, in the interwar period and just after the Second World War being a closed system. What happens in the 1980s is that money market money comes in. It's financialized. The market is liberalized, which increases the amount of money coming in, and that's going to drive up prices. So liberalisation of mortgage credit is the other point to stress here. 1979 end of exchange controls means that you have the emergence of a much more global capital market. 1980, the end of what was called the corset, which was a penalty imposed on banks that increased their interest-bearing deposits above a set limit. So the amount of money that banks could lend was limited. Removal of that allows the banks to enter the domestic mortgage market for the first time. Building societies were also given much more freedom, which was formalised in the Building Societies Act of 1986, which means that more money can come in through the building societies. We all can remember Northern Rock. So banks come into the mortgage market, they bring in more funding, there's easier credit, they increase the loan-to-value ratio, loan-to-income ratio. This drives up house prices. So what is happening here then is that you have, in Britain, more money coming in, but also the real cost of mortgage borrowing drops for standard tax rate taxpayers. There's a tax benefit, but at a time of inflation, very often inflation is higher than the interest rate. So the nominal interest rate is below inflation. So the real interest on the loans is negative. Again, this is going to lead to a rise in house prices. In some years, the gain on ownership of a house is about 60%. Return is higher than for liquid savings, and there's no capital gains tax on the sale of your main residence. Now, it's different in Germany. In Germany, capital gains tax was levied on the sale of a house within the first 10 years. So that discouraged speculative selling and trading up. So British house purchase has a large speculative element, people looking for higher asset values, and trading up all the time. Of course, we all watch, don't we? Location, love it and list it. That's a sort of obsession that we have in this country. In Germany, There's little or no mortgage market liberalisation in the 1980s. Lending remained conservative with loan-to-value ratios which were more pegged, with strict income limits, fixed rates fixed rates over a period of time, so you're locked in. It's perhaps more like the old building societies in Britain. The example here of the Bauperkasse, which I've taken one example here. You make a contract. You put in, you're locked in. You put in so much a year, for which you get below market rate of interest, and then you borrow when you get up to a certain amount. You borrow again below the market rate, and it tends to be money which is, if you like, within this sort of closed system. So the Bauperkassen agrees a contract with a saver, and when about 40 to 50% of the contracted amount has been accumulated, the saver could borrow the balance to buy a house after the delay of 1 or 2 years. Savers receive low interest, but they also pay low interest. So it's a different form of housing market. And you see a summary of this in this table from a recent book on rethinking the economics of land and housing. It's a major difference. Also a different attitude to housing. Let me quote John Mulbauer again. He says this: Germans buy houses primarily as places to live, while for the British, the portfolio investment motive is a very important consideration. So more savings, more of people's wealth in Britain goes into housing, which you might think is very illiquid, except for the fact you could then borrow on the basis of it. So this collateralization of housing allows you to borrow to go on a luxury cruise or to put a conservatory on your house or whatever it might be. And you can see it's very high, both in the period of Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair. After the global financial crisis, low interest rates, people actually pay off their mortgages a bit. So before 1980, people couldn't do this. It's with this financial liberalisation that housing wealth becomes more spendable, particularly in those two periods. And my final difference is the differences in the rental market. In Germany, private rental remained larger with a balanced age structure, people of all ages. Private rent was a viable alternative to owning occupation. The landlord was able to fix the rent in a new contract, but then further increases after that were rather restricted, and contracts were long, an average of around 11 years. In Britain, private rental was not so popular or stable. Rental contracts in this country are shorter, an average of around 2.5 years. Rent controls, before they were abolished, were more rigid, largely repealed in 1988. And now, of course, the whole issue of no-fault eviction is a serious political issue. Well, this is how we got there. You've seen the crisis. I've told you at the beginning. What are we going to do about it? Well, there are very serious consequences of what I've been talking about. Low saving rate, wider intergenerational inequality between baby boomers with assets and young adults forced into the rental market. It has an impact on productivity and growth. There are housing shortages, poor quality, and high cost. Solution. Well, as I've already said, focusing upon planning is only a small part of the answer. That's an easy non-solution. We need more thoroughgoing reforms, but is anybody going to have the political courage to do it? It's all very well for an academic to give advice. I'm not trying to win an election, I'm just trying to fix the housing crisis. So there is a serious problem here that we know what the solutions might be, but are they politically feasible? Well, what might the solutions be if they were politically feasible? Well, first is to refocus savings to productive investment and away from property that leads to inequality. So more money in this country goes into housing purchase than in other countries. Savings are very low. I've been talking about taxation of land being something which happens in other countries, most other countries, where land value is taken by the community. And this was tried in this country by the Liberal government of 1906 to 14, by David Lloyd George, the People's Budget of 1909, and so on. And taxation of land values does work in some places. Denmark, for example, has municipal taxes based on land values. Australia has land value taxation in Queensland and New South Wales. It's even found in the United States, where you might not imagine that to be the case. Local authorities in Pennsylvania have a form of land value taxation since 1913. There's a very good OECD report on a compendium of all of these land value taxations. So in the Financial Times, Charles Goodhart, a leading economist, was a leading official at the Bank of England, said on the 15th of August 2024 that Rachel Reeves is in a stronger position to introduce a land tax than Lloyd George was in 1909, when obviously the image there was an aristocrat. The image now would be one of these great land bankers. So you could then have a public sector land bank to purchase land, to sell, to redevelop. This would give local authorities a share of the planning gain. One example is Korea, the Korean Land Corporation of 1975. But many people on the right in British politics hold up Singapore as a model of laissez-faire free market economics, without pointing out that they had a new town development, they had a land bank similar to the new town development corporations in this country, which could capture land value. We could have a return, of course, to public sector housing. We could have a change in mortgage finance, so it's not so financialized to inflate prices. You could impose a capital gains tax on sales, if not used for buying a main residence, which is the case in the United States. Could have better regulation of the rental sector with longer contracts. Well, is any of that possible? To some commentators, no. Avner Offer of University of Oxford disagreed with John Mulbar, I think, in this sense. Avner Offer says, the problem is that change is blocked by the winners, the early movers, the NIMBY supporters that I mentioned, dominating in a large number of constituencies. It's what he calls a wicked problem, one you can't solve. But is that too pessimistic? Well, what I've been showing here by using history is that change does happen. We shouldn't assume that what we have now is given. There were radical shifts in tenure around the First World War and in the 1980s. We can't just take opposition to change for granted. Politicians need to construct a story, a narrative about the need of reform, and not just react to focus groups. You could, I suppose, if you wished, start to build up a notion of unearned wealth, which was used by Lloyd George in 1909, attack the unearned wealth of aristocratic landowners. And who was one of the major supporters of that in his great book, Liberalism and the Social Problem of 1909? Winston Churchill, who said that this is not a proper, if you like, free market society if these monopolist landowners are taking all the gain. So I've told you what's wrong. I've told you what some of the solutions might be. What we need now is politicians with the courage to present a compelling case to do it. Thank you.